A lady never imagined that her children would be capable of something so cruel, but she decided to teach them a great lesson. Even the most merciless heart would be moved to know what happened to her. Margaret Thompson, born and raised among the golden hills of Italy, had the perfection of a fairy tale in her life. Married to Harold, a man of great ambition and a generous heart, she lived her best years under the glow of love and prosperity. Together, they raised 3 children, Albert, Franklin, and Beatrice, and over the decades their fortune grew, as did family ties that seemed indestructible. Sunday afternoons were a parade of laughter and conversation, with children running through the flower gardens of the large villa and adults discussing plans for the future, with an unshakable confidence in what would come next. But the death of Harold, the pillar of the family, brought a deep and deafening silence to the halls of that house. What was once a haven of joy and laughter now felt like an empty stage. The children, Albert, Franklin, and Beatrice, became distant. The pain of losing a father was evident, but what hurt Margaret most was the gradual alienation from her own children. They didn't come anymore. Visits became rare, almost non-existent. The grandchildren, those little faces that once lit up the house, became a distant memory. The phone rarely rang, and letters were rare, his words, now cold, filled with empty apologies and promises that were never fulfilled. Over time, Margaret began to feel like a shadow in her own life, an echo of someone who was once important. She invited her children to visit her, begged them to bring her grandchildren, as if their presence was the only thing capable of giving her back a piece of the happiness that seemed to have been lost forever. But the children, immersed in their own lives and ambitions, did not respond, and Margaret's house, once vibrant and full of life, now became a sad reminder of a time that would not return. She looked out at the empty gardens, feeling the pain of abandonment and loneliness, as the weight of her family inheritance began to become an unbearable burden. On Margaret's 85th birthday, the day dawned sunny, and she woke up excited. The sun shone with a soft intensity, filtering through the lace curtains of the large living room, casting a warm light on the antique walls and precious furniture. Margaret woke up with a smile, her heart beating faster, full of renewed hope. Finally, that would be the day that the happiness she longed for would return. Her children and grandchildren would come, and she imagined the sound of laughter echoing through the halls again. The table was prepared, with carefully arranged dishes, fresh sweets, homemade cakes and golden fruits, all with the perfection of someone expecting a feast for their loved ones. Margaret wore her best clothes, a blue dress that she loved, with delicate hand-embroidered flowers, which she only wore on special occasions. Her silver hair was carefully styled, and she wore a discreet pearl tiara, as if she were a queen on her big day. Margaret was radiant, her anticipation visible in every movement. As the time for her children's arrival approached, she looked out the window, seeing the flower garden that once seemed so alive, now immersed in a comforting silence. She expected to hear the footsteps of her children, the sound of grandchildren running around the house. Joy pulsed within her. Finally, it will be like before, she thought, smiling to herself. But as she arranged a vase of flowers on the table, she heard the sound of the doorbell. Albert was the first to enter, his face always serious, but today it seemed to have a hint of something different. Right behind, Franklin, with his tired face, and Beatrice, who had an expression that Margaret couldn't immediately decipher. They were all there, but something about the way they entered seemed distant. Her grandchildren, the ones Margaret had been waiting for so much, were absent. "Children!" Margaret exclaimed excitedly, her eyes shining. "What a joy to see you! Everything is perfect for our day. I prepared your favorite foods. And where are the grandchildren? I was expecting to see everyone running around the house." Albert looked at the ground. The silence between them became uncomfortable. Beatrice, with a forced smile, replied, "The boys are busy, Mum. They couldn't come." At that moment, Margaret felt a slight uneasiness in the air, a strange feeling that she couldn't identify, but that seemed to be about to take over everything around her. She tried to ignore it, trying to convince herself that it was just an unreasonable feeling. Soon, the other guests began to arrive, and the house was filled with laughter and conversation. The party was wonderful, as I had always dreamed of, with the impeccable decoration and the atmosphere full of joy. However, there was something about his children that didn't feel right. She watched them from the corner of her eye, noticing a distance between them and a colder demeanor than usual. But Margaret didn't want her suspicions to ruin the atmosphere of that special night. After all, the party was supposed to be a celebration, a moment of joy with friends I hadn't seen in so long. So she kept her feelings to herself, forcing a smile and pretending everything was perfect. The night continued successfully, full of laughter, gifts, and precious memories of old friends. Margaret felt loved and surrounded by affection, but deep down, that feeling of discomfort did not leave her. When the last of the people said goodbye and the house became silent again, it was then that her children approached. The smile she had maintained throughout the night faded at the sight of them, as if something had finally come to light. She didn't know what to expect, but she felt the truth was about to be revealed. Franklin, more direct, took a step forward. "Mum, we have something important to tell you." His voice was filled with a tension that Margaret didn't understand. She frowned, her heart beating faster, not knowing what was coming. "What happened, my son? Everything is fine?" Albert looked at Beatrice, who hesitated for a moment before starting to speak. "Mom, we have to make difficult decisions. The house is no longer viable for us. The costs are very high. The employees, the maintenance. We can no longer maintain everything." Margaret felt an ice spreading across her chest, as if a wave of cold had completely invaded her. "What are you saying?" she whispered, the smile she had so carefully placed on slowly fading. Franklin looked at his mother with sadness in his eyes. "We're selling the house, Mom, and you need to move. We found a nursing home that has good conditions. It will be better for you. It will be easier for everyone." Those words, like sharp blades, cut into his soul. She felt the weight of each syllable, the coldness of indifference in their hearts. "No," Margaret whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I can't believe what they're saying. This house is my life. Harold built all this with so much effort, with so much love." Albert, visibly uncomfortable, tried to justify. "I know it's difficult, Mom, but what we're proposing is the best for everyone. We can no longer maintain this. The costs are getting higher and higher, and the house is just a house now." "But what about the moments we spent here?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking. "The laughter, the meals together, the stories told around that table. Don't you remember that anymore?" Franklin lowered his head, unable to look his mother in the eye. Beatrice, with a sigh, tried to soften the situation. "Mom, it's not about what this house represents. It's about you, your health, your safety. The nursing home will give you more comfort. You won't have to worry about anything anymore." Margaret felt a deep pain, an emptiness in her heart. Those she loved most were there, telling her that her entire life, her story, everything she had built with her husband, was now just a weight. She turned away from them, looking at the table, now silent, as if the party she imagined had been destroyed by a cruel blow. "I thought today would be different," she said, her voice shaking. "I thought I would see my children and grandchildren, like before. I wish it was like before." But the words fell into a void. The house, the inheritance, the shared moments, it was all slipping away like sand through his fingers. And in that moment, Margaret realized that the love she believed she had preserved over the years might not be enough to hold her family together. Margaret knew that this would be the last birthday she would spend there, the last moment of happiness she could have. And as she looked at her children, she felt the weight of her life, of her story, slowly disappear, like a distant memory. In the following weeks, Margaret was forced to leave her home, where she had the best times of her life with her late, beloved Harold. She was overcome with a deep sadness, and thought about how much she missed him. Now she was alone in a small room. The nursing home room was simple, with pale beige walls, and a small window that looked out onto a modest garden. The smell of cleanliness was strong, but the feeling of emptiness, of abandonment was still present. The nursing home was located away from the city, surrounded by vast fields and trees that swayed gently in the wind. There was an unsettling tranquility about the place, as if life inside were an eternal pause. Margaret wouldn't get used to that. The weight of loneliness seemed to deepen with each day she spent in that soulless, lifeless environment. The first morning he got up, he dressed slowly, the weight of pain and frustration visible in every movement. She felt the bitter taste of loss, the loss of her home, her freedom, and, most painfully, the distance from her children. Even with the sun shining through the window, there wasn't enough heat to warm his heart. It was then that she met Antonio. He entered the room with a gentle smile, a welcoming expression that contrasted with the coldness of the surroundings. Antonio was a home employee, young with brown hair and light eyes, with a calm posture, but with an attentive look that seemed to perceive more than usual. He brought a cup of hot tea and placed it gently on the table next to Margaret. "Good morning, Miss Margaret. How are you feeling today?" Antonio asked, his voice soft but filled with sincere concern. Margaret looked at him, surprised by his kindness. "I'm fine, considering the circumstances," she replied, trying to force a smile. "But this place is not what I imagined for the rest of my days." Antonio nodded understandingly, as if he already knew she was adapting to something very difficult. He sat in a nearby chair, looking at her empathetically. "I know change is difficult. I understand, Mrs. Margaret. But please know that I am here to help you with anything you need. Whatever you want to do, I can help." Margaret watched him for a moment, noticing the kindness in his eyes. Something in her broke. Maybe it was Antonio's sincerity, or maybe it was the fact that he was the only person to show genuine concern for her. She felt a tear fall, and suddenly she could no longer hold back the pain that she had been holding back for so long. I don't know if I can take it anymore," she whispered, the words coming out between sobs. "My children, they never come to visit me. They made a point of putting me here without even looking back. I feel like I'm forgotten, like I don't matter anymore. The house, my life, everything I built, everything was taken from me." Antonio looked at her with silent sadness. He moved closer and placed his hand gently over hers. "I can't imagine the pain you must be feeling, but know that you are not alone here. Maybe your children won't come, but I'm here, and so are many of the others here. You still have a lot to offer, a lot of wisdom, a lot of stories to share. Don't let the abandonment of some people dim your shine." Margaret looked at him, a mix of gratitude and sadness on her face. You are very kind, but it's difficult. You know, I always believed that family was the greatest treasure. Now, I see that everything I built with so much love, with so much effort, has no value for them. They forgot me." Antonio didn't know what else to say, so he just stood there, silent, offering his presence. Sometimes words are not enough. What Margaret needed most at that moment was someone to listen to her, to see her beyond just an old woman in a nursing home. She needed to feel that her pain was not invisible, that her life still had some value. Over the next few weeks, Antonio became a constant presence for Margaret. He accompanied her on walks around the garden, helped with the small details of everyday life, and, above all, was there to talk. He did not treat her as a simple resident of the home, but as a person with a rich history, a woman who had already lived a life full of ups and downs, a woman who deserved to be heard and respected. But, despite all of Antonio's kindness, Margaret could not escape the reality that surrounded her. The days passed slowly, and she felt like her life was being wasted. The letters she sent to her children were never answered. There were no visitors. There were no gestures of affection, not even a call to ask how she was doing. She was completely isolated, without a shred of hope that things could ever return to normal. One late afternoon, while Antonio was helping her organize the books in a small library at home, she said, with a tired voice and her eyes filled with tears, "I just wanted to go home, to my house with Harold, to see my children happy again, but it all seems so far away now." Antonio looked at her with compassion, but at the same time with a look that carried a silent promise. "Sometimes life takes us to places we don't understand, Miss Margaret. But while we're here, let's make this place home in our own way. It doesn't matter what happened in the past. What matters now is what you can still do, what you can still live." Margaret looked at him, and for the first time in a long time felt a spark of hope light up inside her heart. She didn't know if she could forget the pain of being abandoned by her children, but she knew that perhaps she could find a new purpose, even if in such an unexpected place. "Maybe you're right, Antonio," she said, her voice soft but with a hint of renewed strength. "Maybe I still have something to offer, even if it's no longer for my family, maybe for others around me." And at that moment, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a slight sense of peace. Antonio, with the empathy he developed for Margaret over the weeks, could no longer ignore the obvious abandonment she suffered. With each passing day, he saw the suffering in her eyes, and it moved him to try something more. "I knew that Margaret still had hope, however small, that her children would one day return, that one day they would visit her. So, without further ado, he decided to try, for her." It was a hot summer afternoon, and Antonio was in the home office, sitting in front of the phone. He took a deep breath before dialing Franklin's number, the hardest one to reach, as he already knew the emotional distance between them was great. The line rang several times until the call was finally answered. "Franklin, hello?" Franklin's voice was muffled, as if he were busy with the sound of shuffling papers in the background. "Antonio." "Hello, Mr. Franklin. My name is Antonio. I work at the nursing home where your mother, Donna Margaret, is living. I'm calling to see how she is, as I noticed that Mrs. Margaret has been feeling a little lonely lately. I wanted to ask if you have any plans to visit her soon." Franklin sighed, a sound that indicated impatience, as if he had been interrupted in something important. Antonio. Look, I know my mother is there, but things are very complicated around here. The work is too much, the company is going through a very difficult time, and honestly, I can't go there now. I can't afford to miss any more days of work." Antonio tried not to let the frustration that was beginning to grow inside him show. "I understand, Mr. Franklin. But with all due respect, Mrs. Margaret has been feeling quite isolated. She talks about you, about her family, and loneliness has been difficult for her. Wouldn't it be possible to pay a quick visit, just to show you care?" Franklin gave a nervous laugh. "I understand what you're saying, Antonio, and I really care about her, but I have other priorities at the moment. I really don't know when I'll be able to go. I'll see if I can find some time in the next few weeks, but I can't promise anything." Antonio was silent for a moment, knowing that was the most he could get from Franklin. "I understand, Mr. Franklin. Mrs. Margaret will be waiting, but I thank you for taking my call." The call was disconnected with a simple goodbye, and Antonio felt an even greater weight in his chest. But I couldn't give up. He needed to try at least one more time. With a sigh, he dialed Albert's number. The line rang for a few seconds and went straight to voicemail. After a few attempts, Antonio decided to leave a message for Albert. "Hello, Mr. Albert. My name is Antonio. I'm an employee at the nursing home where your mother Margaret is staying. I'm contacting you because Margaret is very lonely and insists she wants to see her grandchildren. Who knows, you could stop by and visit her. I'm sure she will be very happy. Thank you for your attention." Feeling like there was still a chance, Antonio picked up the phone again and dialed Beatrice's number. The line rang and she answered quickly. "Beatrice." "Hi, Antonio. How are you?" Her voice was friendly, but there was something distant about it. "Antonio." "Good afternoon, Mrs. Beatrice. I'm Antonio. I work at the home where your mother, Donna Margaret, is. I'm calling to see if you have plans to visit. She has missed you very much and has been very sad about not receiving visitors." Now Beatrice paused, and Antonio noticed that she was hesitating, as if she were trying to find a way to give a more convenient answer. "Ah, Antonio, I really wanted to go, but I'm traveling, and I'm going to be away for a few months. I'm doing important work, you know. There's no way I'm going back anytime soon. It's been difficult, but it's what I need to do now." Antonio felt a feeling of discouragement come over him, but he tried to be gentle. "I understand, Mrs. Beatrice. Mrs. Margaret really cares about you and your brothers, and she misses you, but I understand that everyone has their commitments." Beatrice seemed a little more distant now, as if she was eager to finish the conversation. "Yes, I know, and I feel sorry for her. I'll try to call her when I have time, but really, right now, I need to focus on my work." The call ended quickly, and Antonio stood there, looking at the phone, not knowing what to do. He no longer knew how to help Margaret. He had done what he could, but Margaret's children seemed too distant, too busy to give her what she needed most, the affection and attention of her family. As he walked through the silent hallways of the nursing home, Antonio couldn't shake the sadness that settled in his chest. With each step, the weight of the words he had heard on the phone calls became heavier, more painful. He felt disgusted, not with Margaret's children, but with their indifference. How could someone be so distant, so selfish? How could they look at a woman who gave them life, who raised them, who built a family, and just walk away so easily? He sat on a bench in the garden of the home, the sun falling gently on his face, but the light could not warm the cold that spread inside him. I was thinking about his mother, who passed away a few years ago. Antonio always saw her as the pillar of his life, the woman who taught him what true love was, the one who picked him up when he fell, the one who guided him with words of wisdom, always with a welcoming smile, always with infinite patience. Antonio closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him. If he could, he would give anything to have her back, even if just for a minute, to feel the warmth of her embrace again. But life was cruel, and fate was merciless. He knew he couldn't go back, that he couldn't bring his mother back, but what he didn't understand was how Margaret's children could be so callous. He clenched his fists, fighting the growing pain that was building up inside his chest. Anger against Margaret's children mixed with sadness at the loss of their mother, creating a whirlwind of emotions. He couldn't understand how life could be so unfair, how it could allow people who received so much love from their parents to ignore everything those parents did for them. "If only I had more time with my mother," thought Antonio, with his eyes closed, his voice almost inaudible. "I would have taken care of her, I would have done anything for her, and now it's too late." As he looked to the side, at Margaret's bedroom window, he saw a fragile figure, a woman who was now a shadow of the person she once was. He knew that somehow he had the power to ease her pain, to show her that there was still someone who cared. "I'm not going to leave you alone, Miss Margaret," he said in a low voice, with renewed determination. "I'll be here for you, whatever you need." The anger slowly dissipated, giving way to silent compassion. Antonio knew that even though he couldn't replace Margaret's children, he would do his best to be the support she needed, because he knew what it was like to lose a mother, and he didn't want her to have to go through that pain alone. The weeks passed slowly, But for Antonio, each moment with Margaret became more meaningful. He was always there, offering words of comfort, small gestures of affection and care. He helped her dress, take her medicine, and even kept her company during the long, silent days. Margaret, in turn, began to trust him as if he were part of her family. She smiled more now, although the sadness was still there, deep in her eyes, like a constant shadow. One night, however, things took an unexpected turn. Margaret began to complain of severe discomfort. At first, it seemed like just a mild indisposition, something she attributed to age. But as the hours passed, she became visibly weaker, her eyes dull and her skin pale. Antonio realized that something was wrong. He immediately called the nurse, and soon the doctors were called. Margaret was taken to the hospital that night, and anxiety took over Antonio. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't leave her alone. At the hospital, he stayed by her side all night, hoping she would recover. His children, as always, were absent. When the doctors finally gave better news, and Margaret seemed to be more stable, Antonio sat next to her bed, holding her hand. She seemed a little calmer, but still tired. The sound of the heart monitor filled the silence, and the hospital environment seemed cold and distant. It was at that moment that Margaret, with visible weakness, asked him to come closer. "Antonio," she said in a soft voice, almost a whisper, "I have something for you." She raised her hand with effort, and with trembling fingers handed him a small wooden box, aged with time. It was a simple box, but with an air of mystery, as if it had been kept for many years. Antonio carefully took the box in his hands, feeling the weight of something important there. His eyes met Margaret's, who was now looking at him with a serious expression, but full of tenderness. "Inside it, there is a key," said Margaret, in a faint voice. "It opens up something very important to me. I want you to go there. It's a gift for you, Antonio. A gift for everything you've done for me." Antonio looked at the box with curiosity and apprehension. The key within her seemed to be the key to something more than just a simple physical object. It was as if it were the key to a long-kept secret, something Margaret felt she needed to pass on. "But, Madam Margaret, what is it? What will I find there?" Antonio asked, trying to understand the meaning of that gesture. Margaret smiled softly, a tired but full of emotion smile. I can't say everything, darling, but I know you'll understand when you get there." Antonio felt a knot in his stomach. He didn't know what that meant, but he knew he couldn't leave Margaret alone, especially now when she was so fragile. He clutched the box to his chest, with a mix of confusion and gratitude. "I will do as you asked, Miss Margaret. I'll go wherever this key takes me, I promise." Margaret closed her eyes, visibly relieved to have handed over the key, to have shared something so personal. "I knew you would. You were always someone I could trust." Margaret's death happened that night, silently and peacefully, like a sigh at the end of a long journey. Antonio was by her side when she left, and the pain he felt at that moment was overwhelming. He watched her leave with the same serenity with which her life had been marked by her strength and delicacy. But the pain was unbearable, as if a part of him had been ripped away, as if he had lost something he could never replace. He couldn't help but think of all the things he still wanted to say to her, all the times he wished he had hugged her tighter, given her more comforting words. But now, all that was left was silence, the void. The funeral was simple, as Margaret had always requested. No pomp, no big celebrations. She didn't want to be the center of attention, even at the end of her life. Just a low-key ceremony, with a few people, the few who really cared. He was silent throughout the ceremony, without words to express the sadness that consumed his heart. The only thing he could do was hold tight to the key that Margaret had given him, the key that now seemed to carry an even greater weight. What did she want him to do with it? He didn't know, but he felt like it was something he needed to find out. After the funeral, Antonio tried to move on, but the void left by Margaret could not be filled. He spent his days at the nursing home, trying to keep busy, but loneliness surrounded him, as did the constant reminder of the woman he had promised to care for until the end. It was then, a week later, that he received a call that made him stop for a moment. It was a lawyer, someone he had never heard of before. The tone of the conversation was formal, and the lawyer's voice seemed serious, almost impersonal. "Lawyer. Good afternoon, Mr. Antonio. My name is Robert Pierce. I am the lawyer for Donna Margaret Thompson. I would like to schedule a meeting with you to discuss some important matters. Would it be possible for you to come to my office?" Antonio felt a chill. He was silent for a moment, trying to process what he was hearing. Doubt and strangeness took over Antonio, and then he said, "Of course, whatever is necessary to help Mrs. Margaret." The following week, Antonio woke up early and went to the office. He entered the lawyer's office with his heart racing, still trying to understand what was happening. When the door closed behind him, he was surprised to see Margaret's children, Albert, Franklin, and Beatrice, sitting at the table, their expressions closed and impatient. They were visibly tense, as if they were waiting for something important. The tension in the air was palpable. The lawyer, with his professional attitude, gestured for Antonio to sit down. He then looked at Margaret's children and noticed the coldness in their eyes. They didn't say a word. There was something there, something that didn't feel right. Lawyer: Mr. Antonio, as I mentioned, Donna Margaret left some instructions for you. I requested her presence here because she wanted the key you received to be handed over so that we could open the safe where her will was kept. Antonio felt the weight of the situation, as if the environment had become even heavier. He took the key out of his pocket and handed it to the lawyer, who took it with firm hands and went to a small shelf in the corner of the room, where the safe was. The sound of the key turning in the lock echoed throughout the room, creating a feeling of suspense that made Antonio's heart beat faster. The lawyer opened the safe and took out an aged paper envelope, carefully sealed. He looked at Margaret's sons, who seemed anxious, as if they were waiting for a revelation. The lawyer then tore the seal of the envelope and started reading aloud with clarity that seemed to cut the air. Lawyer: Me, Margaret Thompson, being in full use of my mental faculties, I make this will with the full awareness of my decisions. I declare that all my possessions, material and financial goods, will be legated to Antonio, a man who has shown more care, love and loyalty to me in recent years than my own children. He will be responsible for my goods and for the continuity of everything we build. Antonio was paralyzed. The words of the testament were being said, but he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Margaret, the woman he was careful, the woman he had promised to protect, had left everything to him, all goods, all properties, everything, and the most surprising, she had completely excluded her children. Margaret's children were in shock. The silence was broken by Albert, who could not contain the indignation that took over his body. He rose abruptly from his chair, his eyes shining with anger and unbelief. Albert, what is this? How could she do this? We are your children. We grew up with her. We took care of her while she was fine, and now she leaves us like this without even giving us an explanation. Franklin, always the calmer, but with a tremendous voice of fury, also got up. Franklin, this cannot be true. She couldn't have done that. She knew we needed her help. How can you? How can she leave everything to a stranger? Beatrice, with tears in her eyes, looked at the lawyer as if he expected he could change the words he had just read. She, visibly shaken, tried to control herself, but the anger and pain were visible on her face. Beatrice, she couldn't do it that. I couldn't. We were her family. We were her children. How could she get away from us like this, without even giving us a chance to show that we loved her? Antonio felt a mixture of guilt and confusion. He knew Margaret had moved away from his children, but did not imagine that she had made such a drastic decision. He looked at her children, now clearly taken over by anger and disgust. It was not just the pain of losing a mother, but the feeling of being rejected, irreparable. The lawyer, noticing the growing turmoil, tried to calm the situation. Lawyer, I understand that this situation is difficult for all of you, but according to the law, Donna Margaret's will is valid. She made this choice, and it was her final decision. Her inheritance and her goods now belong to Antonio. Albert, not wanting to hear more, shouted with despair. Albert, we can't accept it. She couldn't have done that. It cannot. We are her family and he's just an employee, a stranger. The tension in the room increased even more. Franklin and Beatrice began to argue, talking about the injustice they were experiencing and how their mother had been carried out by a man who, in their view, had no right to inherit anything. Antonio felt powerless in the face of that anger and pain. He didn't know what to say. He never wanted things to reach this point. He just fulfilled his role as someone who cared. But now he was at the center of an emotional storm. Antonio, I don't know what to say. I didn't want that. I just took care of her. I just did what I thought was right. She trusted me. But his words seemed useless. Margaret's sons were beyond reason, immersed in anger and frustration. The room seemed to have become a battlefield, where pain and betrayal were the only things they could feel. The lawyer tried to intervene again, but the situation was already out of control. He looked at Antonio, who now felt the weight of that decision falling on his shoulders. What Margaret had done not only had separated them from her, but now, with the inheritance, the break seemed definitive. In the following weeks, Antonio was invited to sign the legal rolls and formalize the possession of the goods that Margaret had left him. He bought a beautiful house in a quiet area with a large garden where he planned to live with his wife, Clara. He always thought of Margaret, how generous and confident in his heart had been, leaving him everything he had. But deep down, Antonio felt a void, a deep desire that she was there to see what he had achieved with the gift she had given her. He wanted to thank her, tell her how much she meant to him. If only she was alive to see all this. But what was left were the memories, the longing and the pain of a love not corresponded by those who should love it most. This story became a warning to all of us. The importance of taking care of our elderly, not leaving them helpless, not ignoring the needs of those who gave us so much throughout life. Margaret's abandonment for his own children was a cruel reminder of how often indifference and selfishness can take care of those who should be the first to show love and respect. We must learn to value and take care of those who most need our attention, because in the end, the true value of a person is in the affection and care we give them, not in the material possessions that we can accumulate. If you like this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Here you will find exciting stories every day, made to touch the heart. And I'm sure the story that is appearing on the screen now will thrill you too. Don't miss it.